You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
G'day listeners, welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. I'm your host Mick, and this week I talk with Carrie Morgan. She's a corporate lawyer by day, a fiction author by night, and she is exploring contemporary veteran issues through fiction and raising awareness amongst the wider community. But before I get to the chat, I'd like to do some admin. Thank you to those who are following the Dead Prussian podcast on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, and also thanks to those who have liked the Facebook page, The Dead Prussian, on Facebook. Also, a few reviews have popped up on the Australian and the US iTunes site. Thank you very much for that. If you haven't left us a review on the iTunes website, please go along and do. The more reviews on the iTunes site means the more people that can listen to us. If you don't follow us on Twitter, and if you don't like us on Facebook, well, the only thanks you get are those thanks for tuning in and listening. That is probably 1/4 of my full thanks. If you do these things before next episode, you'll receive one full thank load. Now, you probably didn't download the episode to listen to me yammer on about reviews and Twitter, so here's the interview with Carrie. G'day listeners, it's your host Mick here, and I'm sitting down across the time-space divide using Skype with author Carrie Morgan. Carrie uses fiction to explore contemporary veterans issues. G'day Carrie, how are you?
I'm doing very well, thanks Mick for inviting me for a chat.
Thank you very much for coming on. Can you give us a little bit of a background about yourself, as well as a synopsis from your latest book, The Road Back from Broken?
Yeah, sure. Well, my name is Carrie Morgan, and I am a writer. Suppose I should say I'm a corporate attorney by day, but I think at heart I have always seen myself as a writer, and I squeeze my writing in as best I can, nights and weekends. And I live, on the other side of the time-space continuum here in Central Florida, with my husband, who is in fact a veteran of the U.S. Army. So I just in last October released my debut novel. It's called The Road Back from Broken, and I'm pretty excited about it. I've got a pretty good feedback from folks so far. The Road Back from Broken is the story of a military family and the struggles that they encounter in the wake of their soldiers' return from Afghanistan. It's set in the summer of 2009, and the story picks up 4 months after Master Sergeant Jacob Fitzgerald has come back from Afghanistan after being seriously wounded in an IED attack, which ended up taking the life of another soldier. And where the story picks up, he is largely healed from his physical wounds, but his mental state is really a complete mess. And he's turned to alcohol to numb the guilt and the anguish he feels over the experience he went through and the loss of his comrade. And his drinking catches up with him ultimately, as it often does. And he gets in a DUI crash, which basically leaves him one screw up away from a bad conduct discharge. It sends his behavior, his drinking, sends his wife and son basically fleeing halfway across the country to the refuge of his wife's parents' house. And all of this, the threat of the loss of his family and the loss of his career, basically forces Fitz to sober up. But what we find is that sobriety is no cakewalk, and he really struggles with it as he tries to stay clean. It's difficult because sobriety throws open the floodgates for him and his repressed memories, these things he's been trying not to deal with. And he's really forced to deal with them, forced to come to terms with what happened to him over in Afghanistan and his role in the death of his comrade. And he has to sort through all that. And along the way, we see him and his family struggle to find their own way back to a new normal, to come back and become whole as a family again. And that's my book.
It definitely sounds like a more interesting book than what I'd imagine most corporate attorneys dream of writing. Now this is some pretty heavy stuff, and it's since the past 15 years of conflict, it's not exactly a topic that is not out there, or in some places it's considered quite a sensitive topic. And what coming from a military family background, what motivated you to write about veterans issues this way?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Because it's funny. People are like, you wrote a book. What's your book about? And I tell them, and they're like, they can't believe I wrote a book on that. And they're like, why would you want to write a book about that?
Yeah, why would you want to get yourself down and depressed straight
Yeah,
away?
right. Yeah, it sounds really intense and serious. Well, the fact is that I've always been really fascinated by military history, and really more so, like especially the personal narratives of people's experiences. Neither of my parents served in the military, but both of them have parents who did, and I think that's actually pretty common. My mom's mother, my maternal grandmother, was a widow. Her first husband was killed at San Lo in the summer of 1944. And after the war, her second husband, she remarried. Her second husband had spent the duration of the war in the Pacific. He fought at Guadalcanal, but he spent the next 50 years drinking away the memory
Hmm.
of those experiences. Um, on the other hand, my father,
Yeah.
his dad was a Jewish refugee who fled Germany in December 1938, just 6 weeks after Kristallnacht, and came to the United States. Ended up returning to Europe in 1944 as an U.S. Army interrogator. So while neither of my parents served, both of them definitely their childhoods were impacted by the fact that both of their fathers did experience war. And while neither of my grandfathers ever talked much about their experiences during the war, it was really clear to me, even as a young person, that those experiences deeply affected them. And the things that they saw, the things that they did, it affected them for the rest of their lives. And as an adult, I came to see that who they became in their post-war lives, and in turn how they related to their wives and their children, my parents, were affected by those experiences that they had at war. And so I've kind of always been really fascinated by that. Um, One of the themes in The Road Back from Broken is this notion that the experience of war really ripples through families and it echoes across generations. There's actually research out there that talks about how the children of Holocaust survivors or other people who experience war trauma, that those children actually, it affects them, and it's almost as if they experience the trauma themselves. And so in Road, it's not just Fitz who's broken at the outset of the book. I mean, his difficulties and the fact that he's turned to alcohol and he's not dealing with his own trauma, his difficulties have broken the bonds between him and his wife, between him and his son, between him and his parents, and
Mm.
those difficulties even impair how his wife relates to her own son. So these kind of second order effects of the experience of war have always been really interesting to me, and so I wrote Road, and I'm exploring them further in my second book and in a third project I've got waiting in queue. So
That's really interesting and a great take to play on it. I mean, it's important, I suppose, for people out there to understand that veterans aren't just single young males going out there. They come back to families and homes, and those that struggle through times means that someone else will also be struggling alongside them. Now, your husband's a veteran. Did he assist you in the writing of the book?
yeah, he actually did. Now my husband served in the U.S. Army Infantry, but he was in a peacetime army, served in the late 1980s, and actually got out. Just in time he didn't to serve in Desert Shield or Desert Storm, but he was in the army during a period of time where we still had Vietnam veterans in the force. When he was going through the infantry school at Fort Benning and was a drill corporal there, he had drill sergeants who were Vietnam, combat vets. So these are guys like my protagonist Fitz, like a generation or two removed. But these are guys who spent 18, 20 years in the army, men who'd seen a lot, who'd been through a lot. So my husband's perspective, having spent time in the army with guys like this, I had gained through listening to Lars tell these stories about his experience and the guys he met along the way. It was really helpful to me, and of course he was one of the people who read the draft and gave me some feedback along the way. So that was pretty helpful. But I think what really was more than anything is from the beginning, he really believed in me, and from the very beginning believed that what I was doing, writing this book, telling this kind of story, was important. He told me once, he's like, "Hey, you didn't serve, but this kind of thing that you're doing and telling these stories, this is a way of serving those people and giving back." And that meant a lot to me, and that was really huge because I feel like that telling stories is a way of reaching out and trying to help people understand the experiences of others and sometimes their own experiences, and to have his support in that process and doing that was really, really, really key for me.
Yeah, it's excellent. It's having your own personal subject matter expert on hand to assist you, but also you've got your own personal reviewer as well.
Yeah, it was really great, and I also got some help from some other folks along the way. I mean, one of my beta readers, beta readers like a beta tester for software, except they do it with a book, right? One of my beta readers was a former Army medic who I met through a friend of a friend of a friend, and he had struggled over the years with post traumatic stress and dealing with his experiences in combat, and he provided feedback both with regard to the kind of the, you know, how good a job did I do telling the story of a person suffering with trauma, but also just some of the medical stuff he actually was like, oh, well, actually, if he had had that drug, his pupils would have done such and such. I was like, oh, that was great, So, and then, when I was midway through the process of editing Road, I'd already written the draft and I was working through kind of fine tuning it, getting it ready for prime time. I was invited to join the Military Writers Guild, and one of the members, Ty Mayfield, was really helpful for me, both as a translator. He actually helped me translate some of the key, couple of the key passages into Dari, Persian. But he was also, in general, he's been a really, really terrific cheerleader along the way as I made my way through this kind of bumpy process where you go from draft to actual publication.
It's excellent to see the Mill Writers Guild get involved. For those listeners out there who don't know who they are, they're a network of people around the world who write about military affairs, and they network and help each other out. And it's actually good to see that it's a community that's coming together and helping out people such as yourself deal with these important issues in a way that can reach a wider audience. Talking about wider audiences, and also you've had help from some of the veterans, your husband, your medic friend who could tell you about the wonderful effects of certain types of drugs. In general, how has the book been received both by a military veteran community, if you've had any feedback, and also the wider audience? And if your Amazon reviews or anything to go by, it seems like it's been pretty good.
Yeah, thanks. I really have. I've gotten really, really good feedback, and that's been really good to see. And I've gotten good feedback both from folks who are veterans or in the military community, and then also from sort of the wider audience of civilian readers. When the book came out in late October, one of my very first reviews came from a civilian reader, not a veteran, and she made a really, really interesting comment. To start off her review, she said, "This book made me remember how quiet my parents were when my dad came back from Vietnam. I'd forgotten the tension that surrounded us. We were both happy and sad." And I was so moved by that comment, because one of my goals as a writer is to, tell stories that help my readers become more acquainted with experiences that are beyond their own, or else become better acquainted with their own actual lived experiences. And so when that reader said that, it was great. Somehow this story of Fitz, who was a veteran of the war in Afghanistan, a contemporary veteran, that story about him and his family and what happened, internal to them, helped her look at her own experiences as the child of a war veteran and see it in a different way. And for me as a writer, that's really, really rewarding to see. Because I believe really deeply that war isn't something that just affects the combatants, like you said, like the single guy who goes off to war. It's not just the combatants who serve and are affected by that experience, but it's obviously civilians in the war zone, and also civilians at home. Family members, caregivers, other people in that soldier's intimate community. So to have civilian readers who've told me, who've never served, tell me that they were moved by the story, that the story made them think about their aunt or their uncle or their dad or their brother or the guy down the block, that's really, really powerful. And it's been equally powerful to hear from men and women who serve in the military, that the story moved them, that the story, reminded them of comrades or even, of their own sort of lived experiences. I've gotten some great feedback from veterans. A guy who served with the 10th Mountain Division in Somalia read the book and was really moved by it. A couple of guys who served over in Iraq and veterans currently serving military folks. So that's been really validating for me as a civilian writer, because above all, I think I wanted this story, Fitz's story of his family, to ring true, to be authentic. And if I did everything I could to get it right. And from what I'm hearing from my military readers, I did it. I got it right. So that's been really gratifying.
Yeah, I mean, the topic put yourself in a very difficult place when you start out to write a book about military, a veteran and veterans issues, as well as how it affects the civilians when they come home. You kind of have to get both the military side and civilian side right to appeal to both the military audience and also the civilian audience. It definitely sounds like you've had some success there. Now, the book, fits the character. Has obviously got some issues from his tour. He's got a bit of PTSD. Survivor's guilt seems to be a key theme running through it.
Oh yeah, definitely.
In your experience and in your interaction with veterans today, what do you consider to be some of the key issues that the veteran community is facing?
Yeah, there's it's an interesting question. There's like a jillion of these blog posts, think pieces written out there on the civil military divide. At least that's what we're calling it here in the States. I wrote a post on that, and I think that really the perception of that divide, as there being this big gap between what folks who've served in the military, and especially folks who serve in combat, know and understand and feel versus the civilians who may be detached from it all. I think the perception of that divide, more than the actual divide itself, is a real barrier to helping veterans, reintegrate back into civilian life and into their communities. I mean, if you're out there reading what's written in the military blogosphere and the military community about Twitter, you're going to hear people say, there's no way you can understand the experience of war if you haven't been there. And I think that's a really damaging way for a military veteran to see the world. It posits this unbreachable chasm between military and civilian experiences that I think it totally writes off the way the service members' experiences, obviously ripple through their family and, their intimate relationships. But I also think it writes off those bonds, those relationships, in the community, in their families, the transitioning veteran needs to reinforce, in order to restore herself or himself as a member of their community. So, but that said, I think, and this is going to be, I think, true of the U.S. I don't know in Australia or the U.K. how much this is, but I think we do a really crappy job as a society, of helping veterans take their military experiences, and I don't just mean the violent experiences of being in combat, but the things you do the other 99.5% of the time in the military, taking those experiences and translating them into useful, meaningful civilian vocations. I know that they're trying to get better about that here in the States. We got all 50 states finally saying that if you drove a truck in the military, we're not going to send you to truck driving school when you get back into civilian world, but we'll let you take a test to show your capability. That's getting better, but I still think we're not doing a very good job of helping people transition. I think that's huge. And I guess one other area I think is a problem has to do with, and this I think, is something that the U.S. is really, really, really bad about, is the treatment of women veterans. At least in the U.S., we've done a really dodgy job of addressing the needs of women veterans, which is a total travesty considering how many American women have served honorably in uniform, since the Second World War. But even now, we're talking about opening up combat arms position to women. And yet, you look at VA hospitals, nearly 1 in 4 Veterans Administration hospitals doesn't have a full-time gynecologist on staff. Women veterans in the U.S. are considerably more likely than their male counterparts to be placed on the VA's, waiting lists, which is a big scandal here in the U.S. in general. These women, they earn their right to receive care every bit as much as their male counterparts, comrades, but they're not getting it. And I think that's a real problem that needs to change.
I'm sure there are some listeners out here who have read the book and are keen to know where it goes. Have you started the next book by any chance? And Can we get a clue as to the topic and likely story?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, actually, as a matter of fact, I am working on my next book. My new project is called What Fury Left Behind, and it's a sequel to The Road Back from Broken. Okay. So Fury picks up in 2012, so that's a couple of years after the main events of The Road Back from Broken. So without spoiling things too much, I guess, so the end of Road shows Fitz and his family preparing to move from Fort Carson in Colorado to Fort Bragg in North Carolina. And so Fury takes place at Fort Bragg. And we get to see how Fitz, Jen, and Ryan are doing 3 years out from that IED blast that changed their lives so dramatically. And for those people who read Road and like the character Remy, they're going to be happy to know that the quirky army chaplain is going to be coming back for the second book. In fact, the title, I get an army chaplain who's not quite Father Mulcahy from, if you folks kind of think army chaplain, they think MASH, but Remy's sort of he's a bit of a different character.
Yeah, well, I think every army chaplain I've ever met's quite unique in their own ways. So
yeah,
it's good to hear.
That's true. So the title, What Fury Left Behind, is in part a reference to Remy, actually, because he gets transferred to Fort Bragg to serve as the rear detachment chaplain for the 82nd Airborne's 4th Brigade, which is deploying to Afghanistan, and it is called the Fury Brigade. So Remy is actually literally what Fury left behind. It leaves behind a skeleton crew, rear detachment, of which a major figure in that is the rear detachment chaplain. So for those who read the book, and I've gotten some feedback from folks who are like, yeah, Jen, Fitz's wife, Jen, she's really interesting. We want to know more about her. So in Fury, we're going to get to learn a bit more about Jen's background, her history from the time that she spent as a civilian nurse working at Fort Bragg's base hospital back in the 1990s. It's going to be kind of a different book, the arc in The Road Back from Broken is really about Fitz and him pulling himself back together, the family pulling themselves back together. It's sort of focused in that way. But in Fury, we're going to see a little bit of a difference. It's going to be more focusing on, Fitz is going to start to struggle with some of the physical challenges, both as a result of his old injuries and age. I mean, he's 42 years old when the sequel starts. And he's going to start thinking about what is life for me after the Army going to look like, and that's a difficult question for somebody like him. And it's going to be a question that doesn't just impact him, but also his wife and son, who've been journeying with him along the way. We're also going to see Remy and his wife. He's the rear detachment chaplain, so he's going to be dealing with the burden of supporting the partners and families of the Fury soldiers.
Yeah.
Deployed downrange, and see how they're impacted as these casualties come in. I mean, he's not downrange. They're not actually directly impacted, but caregivers, there's a burden to caregivers too. And I think sometimes that doesn't get talked about. It's something I want to touch in the new book, And then we're going to see another family, one that's new to readers, and they're going to be dealing with the difficulties, of their own after their soldier comes home badly wounded from Afghanistan. So got a lot of things kind of going on in this new book. I'm working on it, right now, and hopefully, with some luck, I should be able to have What Fury Left Behind ready for prime time, maybe late this year or sometime in the early part of 2017.
That's excellent to know, and I mean the topics covered seem like something that a lot of military families will be able to relate to, and something that might shed a light for a lot of those who don't have any experience with the military out there. Always good to have a story in there on what happens to a veteran or military member when they've done 20 or so years in the military. They go to leave, yet they're still, in relative terms, a very young individual. Someone in their mid-40s could have had nearly a 30-year career in the military, yet they've still got half their life ahead of them. It sounds like absolutely a complex book you've set yourself again. So you obviously enjoy challenges. Corporate law must not be that challenging over there. Or maybe it's just a great break from the law itself. I've got one more question. This is a question that any guest that comes on the show has to answer. It's a one sentence question. I'd like to say one sentence or less, but then I'd sound like a goose. I would like you to finish the sentence, war is.
I had to give this one some thought. I saw some folks talking on Twitter, struggling with how to sort of define it. So I gave it some thought. And this is what I came up with. War is an organized campaign of state or community sanctioned violence that while finite in space and time, is an experience that alters the lives of combatants and affected civilians in ways that ripple through communities and societies for decades to follow.
That is an excellent effort. I must say that one's going to be written down, probably posted up on the site. That is also different from the other offerings we've had so far on the show. So it's excellent for me because it means I can give the listeners variety out there. But the important point that you've included, I think, in there is the societal effects before and after war. And during, I suppose, is something that a lot of people from the West who've had expeditionary armies for the past few years, haven't experienced war on the home front for a long time. We've got to remember that there's a lot of places where war is the norm. That is good. That is also probably too long for a Twitter.
I don't think it's 140 characters.
No,
I looked at it and I go, uh-oh.
The conversation on Twitter has been great. I think I've frustrated a few people by asking them to keep it as in one sentence and as short as possible. There's been a lot of screenshots of some word processing attempts there to try and nail it down. But that's an excellent effort. Thanks for that, Carrie. We continue to try and define war on the Dead Prussian podcast. But one way that we will always need to look at it is from the non-military perspective and also exploring it through lots of different mediums. This show is one attempt, and certainly your current book, The Road Back from Broken, is another attempt, and from all reports, a very successful attempt to explore war and how it affects multiple aspects of society. For those listeners out there who'd like to get their hands on The Road Back from Broken, I've got the Kindle version from Amazon, as you hear all the time on the show. I'm not sponsored by Amazon, guys. I just have a Kindle, and that's what I use all the time. There's also the paperback format as well, and after this interview, but as the listeners are listening to this show, I'm pretty sure it'll be out on Kobo and iBooks as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. It should be available for... Road will be available on iBooks, Kobo, and Barnes & Noble's Nook on the January the 19th. So by the time I think this airs, folks will be able to find it from one of many different outlets. And it's available in paperback from Amazon as well as paperback from Barnes & Noble. So, welcome folks to read it and offer their feedback. Start or continue the conversation about what war and conflict does to people and families. I think that's really, really important aspect of this that needs more talking about.
Yeah, it's definitely an important conversation that not only needs to be had once, but needs to continue in every society in order to determine, not only what war is, but what is the cost of war. Carrie, thanks very much for coming on the show. You've given up your Sunday afternoon for this, so I definitely appreciate the chat, and I hope all the listeners out there got something out of it.
Thank you very much.
Well, there you have it, listeners. That is my chat with Carrie Morgan, super lawyer by day, super fiction author by night. I think you'll find that she has a lot to say, and the way she says it is a very effective medium. In fact, exploring some of these issues through fiction is quite a novel idea. A novel idea. I can't do better than that. All right. Thanks to everyone who's engaging on the conversation on Twitter this week and last week. This week I want to talk about the cost of war in terms of families, communities and society. So follow the hashtag, the cost of war, and we'll see where we can go with that. But until next time, grab a book and crack on.
On the next episode of The Dead Prussian, Mick talks with someone about something, probably war. I would love to be able to tell you more, but your beloved host was too lazy to produce an advance copy of his show notes. Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at The Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced, and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.